Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar covering the Google Web Vitals update and site speed. Um, Today, I am joined by my colleague, Ronnie Shapiro. First of all, my name is Russ Jeffrey. I'm the Director of Strategic Integrations. I work with a lot of the apps in the App Store, and I also am deeply involved in a lot of other sides of Duda. And today also I'm joined by Ronnie as well. Ronnie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi guys. So I'm Ronnie. I'm director of R&D. My team is based in Israel. All of the devs. We are in charge of all the development and engineering work of developing products, features, as well as what we are here for today: PageSpeed, performance, and Lighthouse.
Great. Happy to have you here, Ronnie. It's cool to do this with you. So guys, today on the agenda, we've got a lot to cover and a lot of good information for you guys. So the first thing we'll cover is we'll go over a little bit of the news from Google. This is about a month and a half old at this point that Google really announced some of these changes. We'll then go into also some of the PageSpeed updates as well, related to either PageSpeed or the Lighthouse tests that are similar to Web Vitals. We're then going to cover kind of what it means to score well on this test. Kind of give you some guidelines and benchmarks for you guys to work off of, especially when discussing this with clients, because it is pretty complicated and also kind of overwhelming at times. We'll then cover how Duda scores, generally how our websites perform within this ranking and scoring system. We then want to cover a lot of what Duda does from an optimization perspective. So these are just things that we cover out of the box. Additionally, we will cover some things that Duda is working on next, because speed is a continual investment from the Duda side. And finally, we do have some tips and tricks to cover as well for how you guys can make sure that when you're building a site with Duda, you can build for speed. We will have time at the end for a Q&A, so please go ahead and ask those questions at any point during the presentation or during the webinar today. I'm joined by some of my colleagues who are here to answer questions as well, and we'll also be surfacing questions up to Ronnie and myself, so feel free to ask those at any point. One note of housekeeping, we are recording this webinar, and anyone who did register will receive a replay. So if you need to drop off or you want to send this to a colleague, that'll be available usually a day or two after this session is over. So with that being said, let's dive in. Let's start covering some of the content itself. So the first thing we're going to cover is discussing this Web Vitals announcement from Google. And the Web Vitals announcement is really Google trying to organize all of these different metrics that they put out into the world. So I don't know if you've had this experience. I have certainly gotten confused at some point by how many different tools and speed tests are out there from Google. And the Web Vitals are what Google is trying to put out there is, hey, these are the 3 things we are looking at that we're using across multiple different properties. So they're using this in search. They're probably going to be using this in ads as well, in many different places around the web. And so the Web Vitals are essentially that core group of metrics that Google is using across the board, across the entire Google organization. What these new metrics are, you can see documented here. One is LCP, which is largest contentful paint, FID, which is first input delay, and CLS, which is cumulative layout shift. Each one of these kind of represents either loading, interactivity, or kind of visual stability of the actual web page or of the performance of the web page itself. And they're really trying to measure different aspects of the loading performance of a web page itself, right? The LCP metric, or the largest contentful paint, is saying, great, what is the largest element on the page, and how long does that take to load? What Google is trying to optimize therefore is saying, great, you should be looking to load the biggest piece of content or the primary piece of content of that page or above the fold as quickly as possible. You can see on the right side, anything less than 2.5 seconds is a good metric for largest contentful page. For FID or for interactivity, what they're saying is when somebody touches the website or taps on their phone or clicks a button or tries to scroll, that your website is responsive. So you want the website to respond as quickly as possible during that loading process. So what this means is preventing excess code from running, making sure that the website responds quickly to user touches immediately. And the final metric is CLS, and this is during the actual loading of the page, does the website shift around? I'm sure we all have had experiences where you're visiting a site and the content jumps around as content loads. Maybe an ad loads in the middle of a page and it pushes text further down the page, or maybe a video hasn't fully loaded and the video loads at the top of the page, but it loads late. And so your eyes either have to shift or your fingers have to shift when you're interacting with the web page itself. So these are the new core web vitals that Google is going to be using across the board for any of their kind of ranking systems. Now, what Google is going to be introducing is essentially the core web vitals are part of the overall experience metrics that Google is going to be using. So these are basically signals that Google is going to be inputting into their search algorithms. They'll probably be using web vitals also outside of search as well. But what Google is really trying to do here is they're optimizing for the experience of a website. Performance is an overall aspect of experience. And so the web vitals are looking at performance, but you do see that Google is using other experience-based metrics as inputs into their search engine ranking. Mobile friendly is a perfect example. This was introduced 5 years ago, but they are looking for experience-based things where they're saying, great, on the mobile friendly test, we are making sure that links are not too close together. We are making sure that content fits in, the view of the phone. These type of things they're looking at for another metric of experience as well. And so essentially Google is trying to quantify all of these different things that lead to an overall good experience on the website. And now these core web vitals are going to be a very strong component of that overall experience that Google is trying to kind of classify and rank for as part of these metrics. Now, what Google announced about a month and a half ago now is that web vitals are going to be a core part of the ranking factor. Google has not given us an exact date of when these will go into effect. They said sometime in 2021. Now, they also said that they are taking into account that they will give a 6-month heads up before they actually release this into the wild. So they give web designers and webmasters and website owners time to update their websites to do well with these ranking factors. Google is also very conscious of the COVID situation, where businesses might need to prioritize other resources over speed. And so they are essentially saying they will announce it pretty far in advance, but they're not going to announce it yet because they don't feel like that they don't feel comfortable asking webmasters to prioritize this over things related to COVID and running their business more broadly. And so look for this, but it is coming. The one thing I will note is that what we're really getting from Google here with this experience is they are really trying to classify that experience and the performance metrics to date. In the past, when we've talked about page speed as a ranking factor, Google was not very specific about what they meant for speed or performance as a ranking factor. And so these web vitals give very clear indications and very clear kind of benchmarks for website owners to hit and really focus on. In the past, they didn't announce exactly what those speed ranking algorithms were. And so this is really cool to see from Google, the fact that they're actually telling us these things, exactly what they're measuring for. And just one note, Google uses a lot of ranking factors. Speed speed and performance and experience are important, but they're not the number one or number two or number three ranking factors, right? Those things are still the content you're delivering on the website, the backlinks that exist, and the overall, are you answering the question that is coming in from search? And so these are not the defining ranking factor. They are just helpful indicators to Google that you are doing your best to provide a good experience to your visitors who will be coming to the site. Great. So with that being covered, that's essentially what the Web Vitals news is and kind of the context related to that. The next thing we wanted to cover here is the Lighthouse or the PageSpeed updates. At the same time that Google announced the Web Vitals, they also updated Lighthouse to what's called version 6 or V6 of Lighthouse. And V6 includes some of these Web Vital metrics as part of it. So Google is saying, cool, we have these Web Vitals, let's introduce it across the board, and let's integrate it in these other tools that we're using. So this is an example of them putting Web Vitals in other performance tools that they have. So Lighthouse, essentially what they've done is they've changed the classification. They've introduced some new metrics of how they classify and how they score websites. But these are not major changes based on what you've prioritized in the past. These are very much an evolution of what were there before. These new metrics that they're using, one is LCP, it's that same largest contentful paint that exists in the Web Vitals. CLS, cumulative layout shift, is also in Web Vitals. The other new metric Google is introducing in Lighthouse is TBT. It's a total blocking time. It's similar to first input delay. The reason there's a difference here is that Lighthouse is based on lab data. So when you run a Lighthouse test, it is essentially trying to emulate and act like a smartphone or act like a laptop, and they're not able to actually measure first input delay as part of the actual lab data. And so they're using the replacement of TBT or total blocking time as the replacement. But it's trying to accomplish that similar goal, which is interactivity. And so this is just Google saying, great, we can't measure for FID, let's do something similar in place of that. Like I said, these updates, they are roughly similar to what they've had in the past. You're optimizing for some of these same vitals that Google introduced, right? You're optimizing for the how fast you can load that initial content. You're optimizing for how quickly you can interact with it, and you're also optimizing for the visual stability of that as well. And so you can see here on the top, on the right side of the screen here, on the top is the V5, and on the bottom is the V6 of how they score websites in the Lighthouse test directly. So you see a lot of the same metrics are copied over. They also do introduce LCP in there as a metric instead of first meaningful paint. And these timed interactive and total blocking time as well are new metrics that they're adding. If you are optimizing for V6 of Lighthouse, it is very likely that you will do, or if you're optimizing for V5 of Lighthouse, the old version, it is very likely that you will have done well in V6 as well. This is why I call it an evolution and not a revolution. The metrics are more fine grained and they're a little more accurate, but they are not a total, starting fresh and setting new expectations with this new version. This is Google becoming better at how they're classifying and how they're measuring different performance factors on the website itself. Great. So now that we've covered those changes to Lighthouse, let's get into what good scoring actually looks like. So the first thing I'm going to say, and it's going to sound a bit, counterintuitive, is that anything above a 70 is a good Lighthouse score. And even though Google, says their classifying system is anything above a 90 is a green, if you look at the performance of V5, which wasn't that much different, only the top 10% of websites scored 70 or higher. So scoring a 70 on Lighthouse is very strong overall, and it still means your website is fast. Google, by having this really strict rating system at only 90 and above, is setting a very high bar for website owners and designers to really hit that performance score overall. And so what we'll note is that anything above a 70 really is, and I think it's good that Google is setting a high bar, but just because you're a 70 as compared to a 90 doesn't mean your website is slow. Your website still loads quickly. It still loads in under 3 seconds usually for most of that primary content. So just keep that in mind when you're getting this from customers or you're experiencing this yourself. Going from a 70 to a 90 or even a 50 to a 90 is not the total classification of how well you've done. This is how Duda websites actually rank with Lighthouse scores. These are real-world Duda websites, and this is essentially over a week of newly published websites directly. So what you'll see here is these are if you look at these numbers here, these are the percent of websites that score between a 60 and a 69, or a 70 and a 79 across the board for Duda. What you'll see here is most Duda websites are scoring above a 60 on this score. The sites that are scoring to the left or on the lower side are usually ones that have included something above the fold that really slows down the website, or they're including some third-party code that is slowing down the websites as well. And so just keep that in mind. We'll cover some things in a second here of what you can do while building a website to really push these higher, and what Duda sees as things that are frequently dropping the scores down into the lower ranges. But you do see the majority of websites on Duda are scoring very well across the board, but there is a wide range that do exist. So some of those things that actually do slow down your website directly, these are real examples that Duda sees quite frequently. One is custom code. If you're including a website embed, a chat widget, anything that exists within the website itself, this is going to slow down the website. So you need to be careful about adding, these third-party scripts, because Duda has no control over how those perform, and Duda can't really help you optimize those. We can try our best, but it's not going to be something that we can actually help with. Some of the Duda widgets as well will not perform well because they simply load slowly. An example of this is any Facebook widget, a Facebook like, the Facebook feed, these type of things, they are very heavy. It's just a sad fact that the Facebook libraries themselves that you have to use to load these things are very slow, and they're very large. So putting any of these things above the fold or at the top of the web page is going to drastically lower a lot of those performance metrics. The same thing goes for a map widget, the video, or an image slider / photo gallery above the fold. All of these things are very heavy on the page, and we recommend placing those lower on the actual build of the website itself. The next thing that we see very frequently is tracking pixels. Again, Facebook is a big culprit here. The Facebook tracking pixel is large. If you can avoid doing it, we recommend doing it, or only doing it on specific pages of the website. That would be our advice, as compared to every single page as well. The store widget, there's a question already coming in about this that we saw a second ago. The store widget is something that is a little bit slower to load. Duda is working on improving this. So we are taking on a very big project on our side to really try and refresh and make the store more directly part of the website and use standard images and standard layout and standard options within Duda. It's a big project. And make that available. And the last thing I'll cover here is fonts. Fonts is if you use too many fonts, it will slow down the website directly. So avoid using multiple fonts on the site itself if you can. We recommend a 2 maximum, but if you can get away with 1, that's even better. The more fonts you use, the more that the web browser has to download from Google Fonts and parse and make available. So avoid using as many of those as you can and keep that kind of very limited in its scope. So those are things you can do. The next thing I wanted to cover here is this is a big checklist of recommendations from Google. So these are best practices that you can implement across the board when building sites. And these are things that Duda does out of the box automatically for you. I'm not going to read through each one of these, but you can see Duda is making a lot of optimizations for you by default. These are things that are just baked in the platform as part of the value that you get from Duda is that we are optimizing these. The one thing I'll call out on the bottom left is it's kind of a partially filled in, which is reducing JavaScript payloads. We'll get to this in a second where things like TBT or the download size of our JavaScript file is a little bit big. These are things that Duda is looking to improve. So I'm giving us a partial on this because we do a lot better than a lot of other websites, but this is still an area of improvement for Duda. But these are things that we do out of the box automatically and are very valuable to you guys as part of what Duda does. Great. So one thing I did want to highlight as well, these are new additions that Duda has done in about the past 3 or 4 months to improve speed across the board. So we introduced WebP images by default. So all websites now have a WebP image generated. These are just smaller files for images. We enabled what's called Brotli compression. This is a compression algorithm from Google that basically makes files smaller as they transfer over the web. You can see these are ongoing improvements that Duda has made to the performance and to the speed of the website. Actually, Ronnie, who's on the line here, has, I think, probably done all of these or most of these himself as part of the work he's done or part of the work his team has done. And so these are just ongoing improvements that Duda has automatically made and deployed for you guys kind of out of the box. We don't always document these because some of these are pretty small or very technical, but these are improvements that are constantly going on in the background that you don't need to worry about since you're using Duda. So some of the things that we are optimizing next for and what we're kind of focusing on, the first goal is going to be TBT or what's that total blocking time. This is a metric in Lighthouse that calculates how much time your JavaScript runs on the page. So we are going to be focusing on basically trying to reduce that TBT by looking at what's that JavaScript that's running, why is it taking so long, how can we optimize how quickly that runs, and reduce the total blocking time that exists for that code. These are the next projects that we will be taking on related to that. Similar is something called code splitting, where we will be splitting up different parts of the JavaScript libraries that we use and only loading what's necessary in the right circumstance. So an example of this is if you have a photo gallery on the page, we need to run some JavaScript code to load that photo gallery. But if you don't have a photo gallery, we can not load that and not run it and actually not download it at all and save time as well. It's just an example of what we might be doing. And finally, the next thing that we'll be working on is reducing the overall CSS. Again, this is similar techniques and similar tactics to the code splitting of JavaScript, where we're trying to say, great, we know that this page only needs this CSS, so let's only give that CSS instead of everything across the site that might be necessary. These are optimizations that are ongoing, and we're constantly kind of improving on going forward. That's it for the presentation today, guys. What we wanted to actually cover next was we did want to go over and actually look at a Lighthouse report and show and kind of talk through some of the things that you'll see in a Lighthouse report directly. So I'm actually just going to shift tabs here and show you just a website that Ronnie set up a little bit earlier that is scoring on the higher end. So you'll see a performance score here of 94 for this website, and these new metrics that Lighthouse is using to score this website directly. So what you'll see here with this score is that we're ranking very well for the first contentful paint, the speed index, and also the largest contentful paint. The reason we're doing well there is because Duda has this process which we call as critical CSS. What that is doing is that's generating all of the required CSS to load the above the fold content, the first thing you see on the web page, and we're prioritizing that and loading it first on the web page. This is a process that Duda does for every single time you publish a website. We generate what's called the critical CSS for those pages of that website.
Russ, I can jump in and say
yeah,
we even do a little bit more than that. Like whenever you publish a website, we calculate the critical CSS for every device because the critical CSS is different for desktop and mobile. And what we do with this critical CSS, we inline it in the head part, which means you don't need any network request to get this critical CSS. And that's why you see here in the report that immediately the page is rendered with styling. So immediately when the document is downloaded to the browser, it already contains the most important style rules to render above the fold content, and all of the other styling for whatever is in the bottom is downloaded asynchronously in the background.
Yeah, that's exactly right. If you look at some of these screenshots which Lighthouse generates, you'll see what Ronnie is talking about, where you see the colors, you see the button layouts, you see a lot of those styles immediately when the website starts to load here. It's not kind of filling in slowly, which is exactly that performance that you want to show, speeding up those first kind of performance. Now, you do see the area where Duda has the hardest time currently is on the TTI, the time to interactive, and the total blocking time. These are the areas that we're going to be investing in more in the future. But it's essentially that we have code that is running that is needed to be processed on the page itself. And so these they're basically measuring how quickly I can touch and scroll and push a button on the website itself. The final metric you'll see is CLS, or cumulative layout shift, and Duda does very well here. And this is just because of what we were talking about, is that critical CSS. We're not loading things after the fact. We're generating the right dimensions. We're ensuring that content is not shifting around because we have some of that critical CSS, because we're loading some of that those layouts immediately as part of the web page. We do a very good job there. One thing that's kind of confusing about these Lighthouse reports is that these metrics they're reporting on, this is lab data that Lighthouse is reporting. It's from like a simulated device that they're trying to build. And they give you these opportunities that don't necessarily relate back to any of these metrics. So they're telling Duda, or like this Duda website, to reduce unused JavaScript, which it's a best practice, but total blocking time, or time to interactive, is a metric of the code that's actually running. So removing unused JavaScript is actually not going to directly affect the total blocking time or the time to interactive, because these are related to the actual code that's running and still needs to be run on the page. And so a lot of these opportunities don't always directly relate. And while they're good best practices, they're not always going to be what moves you up in terms of a Lighthouse performance or a Lighthouse score higher on the benchmark there. So we wanted to just show that in real time, and you'll see that as soon as you start digging into Lighthouse, you do see a lot of these things which Duda does automatically. It's that same checklist I mentioned a few minutes ago in terms of what are those best practices, what's Duda doing out of the box. We're doing a lot of these things immediately for you, and so it's kind of interesting. Ronnie, was there anything else that you wanted to cover on the Lighthouse test specifically? If not, we can go and jump into Q&A.
I think we can move to Q&A, sure.
Great, let's do it. Great, guys. So the first question that came in pretty early is from Anders asking, what are you doing for PageSpeed on the web shop or for e-commerce? Ronnie, do you want to handle this one? I kind of mentioned it during the presentation, but I didn't go too in depth there. Do you want to cover kind of what we're doing to improve the e-commerce?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, let me just explain why web shop pages are performing badly or not as good as other pages, and that's because our storefront today, our store widgets, are based on a third-party solution. It's not Duda native widgets. So when you add a store widget to your homepage, what's actually happening when the site is rendered is the browser goes to fetch a third-party library, and then it starts to render content in the browser. So rendering content in the browser is a pretty bad practice in terms of performance. It means the browser needs to do all the heavy lifting, and JavaScript needs to start populating the page and start building the DOM elements and everything related to that. And what we do in Duda for all the other widgets that we have is what's called server-side rendering. So the HTML, the DOM itself, is already served as a whole from the server, and all you need is styling, CSS. Critical CSS, as Russ explained earlier, takes care of that. And then the JavaScript should handle just interactivity and not building the content itself. In the store widget, it's not how it's happening today. And what we're working on is building the store widgets natively inside of Duda. So the third party we're working with today will provide the backend, the administration, the back office of the store, and the storefront itself will be Duda native widget, which will be server-side rendering, and they will not rely on any external JavaScript to render, and they should perform much better just as any other widget.
Totally makes sense. Thanks, Ronnie. Great. The next question here is from Roberto. He is asking, is there a way to get this data in the site stats within Duda's dashboard? Today, the answer is no. It's definitely a great feature request, though, Roberto. I like it. I'll talk to Ronnie about getting that implemented. Great. I'm going to jump to the next question here, which is Marcella. What do you recommend for pages listing multiple locations that include a map widget? So it's a great question. So what you're saying is you have one page where maybe we have 3 or 4 or 5 different locations that are referenced. There's 2 recommendations I would make. One is make sure that you have something at the top of the page that essentially doesn't show the map. So it's an introduction to the location. Maybe it's anchor links down lower. You have something what's above the fold or in that initial view that will load first before those maps. And then lower on the page, you actually put the individual map elements in there. If you are very worried about performance on a page like that multiple location pages, you could also, instead of loading the map widget, you could just grab a screenshot of the map itself. and use that as an image rather than the map embed. That's also another option, instead of having the fully interactive map for each one of those locations. But essentially, it's move the maps down the page, allow them to load later in the process as part of the page load, and that will make sure that you're optimizing the initial load as much as possible for those maps, which can be a bit heavier. The next question is from Tyler, and Ronnie, I'm going to direct this one at you. Is there a faster way to load the fonts? Would it be better to embed web fonts?
So I did a little research not too long ago about whether we can load fonts faster, and I started reading about whether we can host the Google fonts ourselves. And the more I got into it, I understand that Google CDN might not be as fast as Duda. We deliver content much faster than the Google CDN, but apparently Google does a lot of work deciding which format of font should be served to every browser. There is a lot of logic behind it. There are many different browsers. They're not all supporting the same type of fonts. And Google has all this logic baked into its CDN, and we cannot really replicate that logic. And that's why it's still considered the best practice to download the font directly from the Google Font CDN. So unless Google does something to the CDN performance, I can't see how we can really improve that. And that's why Russ said, try not using too many fonts in the same page, because eventually we'll need to reach out and download all of that fonts to the page. So yeah, I hope that explains it.
Yeah, I think so. And actually, Ronnie, I think on top of that, Duda is also doing a lot of optimization for the font loading in terms of, we look at what fonts you're using. We try and eliminate additional fonts that aren't being used during this critical CSS optimization. So unfortunately, fonts are just heavy and they take a lot to load. And so just the best recommendation is just to reduce the number you're using overall. That's going to be the best practice.
I can assure you that we are not downloading fonts that aren't used. While you can select from a wide variety of fonts, only the fonts that are actually used are downloaded, and we also know how to download only the subset of the characters you need for that font. The font covers the entire Unicode range, and we don't download the entire characters covered by the font, just the characters you actually use. So we already put quite a lot of effort to optimize it as far as we can.
Yeah, like, and just an example of what Ronnie's saying is, a lot of fonts have, options for Japanese characters or Chinese characters or characters across many different languages. Duda removes all of that automatically if you're not using it within the website itself. So great. The next question comes in from Scott. He's asking about Cloudflare. He says he runs all his Duda sites through Cloudflare, and he's asking, is that still needed? And I think the short answer, Scott, is no. I don't think it's 100% needed. Cloudflare is a great service for kind of acting as a protection layer or a DDoS layer and sometimes a caching layer. But I think in reality, Duda handles a lot of these best practices out of the box. So we have our own internal DDoS protection system. We do a lot of caching on our side of the actual websites and of the content. And so Cloudflare often just adds an extra step on top of the website. And if you have a real reason for doing it, I think that's great. But I don't think I would recommend it, by default for all websites. Just because it adds, a little bit of extra complication to your setup and your usage. So that'd be my recommendation. The next question came in from Ken and Amy. The question is, I was surprised to hear that we should not have too much content on the front page. I thought content was king. Should we put heavier content on inner pages? What advice do you have for the content on the homepage? Yeah, this is a great question. I think there's two reasons why Duda has this recommendation, and Ronnie, feel free to jump in. One is that most of the time, most people are entering your website from the homepage. They're coming to your homepage, either they're searching for your brand or they're searching for your name, or somebody sent them a link, or they're typing that link, that URL in. And so that homepage is often that very first experience. And so if you have a lot of content on the page, that can slow down that initial experience. Now, when we say a lot of content, we really mean heavy content. So that means putting, 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 images on the homepage, or having a big photo gallery, or having several different videos that load on the homepage. If your homepage, if it scrolls for a few seconds, I think that's fine. And what really this recommendation is avoid the excessively long or the excessively heavy pieces of content that you would have on the homepage itself. I think that is what our recommendation would be. If you just primarily have text content, maybe some images, maybe some icons, these type of things, I think that's totally fine to have a long homepage. But really what you want to avoid is a lot of heavy things, or like we've been talking about, the Facebook feeds, the photo galleries, the map widgets, these type of things are what you want to avoid excessive numbers of on the homepage.
Yeah, I can say that when we try to optimize the metrics that Russ showed earlier, when we looked at the largest contentful paint, for example, then this is really tied to what actually is above the fold. What is the largest contentful paint? So if it's just text elements, it will load really, really quickly. But obviously, most sites have some image, hero image, or other widgets above the fold. But if you have like 10 or 15 small images above the fold, that means the browser needs to make 10 or 15 requests to fetch images and render them immediately when the site loads, and that will affect the score. And there is not much like the Duda platform can do about it. So our recommendation is just to find like the right balance, the sweet spot between the right amount of content, and be aware that everything you put that might trigger a network request, or we need to initialize with JavaScript, or will make the DOM tree bigger, it will have some effect on the score, and we just recommend to keep it in mind, especially in the homepage and above the fold.
Great. Cool. Then the next question is from Linda. She's asking, any thoughts on schema? Yeah, I can definitely cover this one. So schemas, it's definitely a different topic than the performance or the experience that we've kind of been really covering today. But schema is in general, it's a great addition to any site. Schema is basically a technical or a structured way of telling Google or other search engines about content on the page directly. So you might have schema that says, great, here's my business. My business is named Russ's Plumbing. Here's my address. Here's my phone number. Here are the hours that I'm open. Schema can tell all of that information to a search engine in a very structured way. And so if you want to add schema to a site, it's definitely something you can do today with custom code. There are tools online that you can generate the schema markup very easily, and then you can just copy and paste that into the head section or into the body end section of the website itself. But it's definitely something that's interesting and should be looked at.
Russ, I'd like to take Alex. Alex asked a really good question about videos, whether
Absolutely.
it's better to upload the videos through Duda or use a service like Vimeo or YouTube. So for those of you who doesn't know, Duda has a new feature to upload videos, and we definitely recommend to use that one. We already do all of the optimizations needed for the video, for bitrate, and to make sure it's really performant, and it uses HTML5 elements, so it doesn't rely on any third-party scripts. Actually, YouTube, if you put YouTube widget above the fold, you will get like 15 in Lighthouse performance or something. YouTube is really, really slow. Today, we handle it pretty well when it's below the fold, we know how to lazy load iframes, and YouTube widget is based on an iframe. So below the fold, we do a pretty good job. Above the fold, it will not work very well. And overall, I strongly recommend to use our own video widget upload.
Absolutely, Ronnie. That's a great answer. I think the same also applies for other embeds too, right? If we're talking about Vimeo, we're talking about Dailymotion, any of these other third-party hostings. While they're great tools, they are pretty slow once you start talking about embedding them within the website. Great. Looks like we are running out of questions here. We've kind of gotten to the end of the presentation and of the content. So with that being said, I would like to just say thank you very much to Ronnie for joining me today, and thank you everyone else for coming and participating. We will send this recording out along with the deck in a few days. Additionally, we do have a webinar coming up on the 18th with our friends from Honeybook related to booking and invoicing and collecting money from clients. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and register. It's available on our registration page for webinars. And with that being said, thank you very much, and we hope everyone has an awesome end to their day.